The Rule of Seven states that no man shall remain alone with the restricted codices after the bells of St. Peter cease their final toll. I am Brother Marcus Toretti, and for 3 years I served as night keeper of the Apostolic Archives Sublevel 7, the deepest repository beneath Vatican City. What I witnessed there challenged everything I understood about our sacred duty to preserve God's written word. My assignment began in October of 2021, when Brother Francis was quietly transferred to a monastery in rural Albania. No explanation was given, though I noticed his hands had developed a persistent tremor, and he no longer met anyone's eyes during evening prayers. Cardinal Benedetti simply informed me that I would assume the night watch, beginning immediately. The Sublevel 7 archive exists 6 stories beneath the main apostolic library, accessible only through a service elevator that requires 3 separate keys. The first belongs to the chief archivist, the second to the cardinal secretary, and the third, a peculiar copper key with Latin inscriptions, was placed in my palm with specific instructions. Never let it leave your person, never make copies, and never, under any circumstances, enter the archive alone. The space itself defied the Vatican's usual grandeur. Concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, temperature-controlled chambers behind reinforced glass. 47 manuscripts rested in individual cases, each marked with red wax seals and catalog numbers that corresponded to no system I recognized. My duties were simple: conduct hourly rounds, maintain environmental logs, and ensure that each case remained properly sealed. On my first night, I noticed the silence, not the peaceful quiet of a library, but an active, pressing stillness that seemed to muffle even my footsteps. The fluorescent bulbs hummed differently here, casting shadows that didn't correspond to any visible objects. I attributed this to fatigue and the strangeness of a new assignment. The manuscripts themselves were unremarkable at first glance. Ancient parchments, illuminated texts, bound volumes in languages I couldn't identify. Each case bore a small placard with minimal information: acquisition dates, basic physical descriptions, storage requirements. What struck me as odd was that none bore the usual Vatican catalog system. Instead, they were numbered 1 through 47, with red stamps reading Custodia Perpetua, perpetual custody. Brother Thomas, the daykeeper, would arrive each morning at precisely 6:30. Our overlap lasted exactly 7 minutes, long enough for me to report any irregularities and for him to confirm that all seals remained intact. In 3 months, we never once deviated from this routine. He spoke little, but I noticed he always counted the cases silently, pointing at each one as if taking attendance. The first disturbance occurred on a Tuesday in January. During my 2 o'clock round, I discovered that case 17's temperature had dropped 3 degrees. The manuscript inside a bound volume written in what appeared to be medieval Latin seemed unchanged, but the glass had fogged slightly. I adjusted the environmental controls and made a note in the log. When Brother Thomas arrived, he studied my entry for several minutes before nodding grimly. 17 is restless this winter, he said. These were the most words he'd spoken to me since my assignment began. That same week, I began to notice patterns. Case 23's humidity reading spiked every Tuesday and Friday. Case 39 required temperature adjustments during the 3rd week of each month. Case Savina collection of loose parchments covered in symbols that hurt to look at, directil occasionally triggered the motion sensors despite being sealed in its case. I started carrying a small notebook to track these irregularities. The patterns were too consistent to be coincidental, too specific to be explained by equipment malfunction. When I mentioned this to Brother Thomas, he looked alarmed. "The irregularities are not for documentation," he said sharply. "They are for correction, nothing more." But correction implied purpose, and purpose implied consciousness. I began to pay closer attention during my rounds, watching for subtle changes that might explain the environmental fluctuations. What I found was far more disturbing than equipment malfunction. The manuscripts were responding to my presence. Case 12 contained a psalter with gold leaf illustrations. During February, I noticed that certain pages appeared to turn themselves between my hourly visits. Not dramatically, just enough that different passages became visible through the glass. The environmental readings remained stable, but something was clearly moving inside the sealed case. Case 34 held what appeared to be correspondence written in a mixture of Latin and symbols that resembled no alphabet I knew. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but twice I found them arranged differently than I'd left them. When I checked the security recordings, the timestamps showed no interruption, no movement that the cameras could detect. By March, I realized that the manuscripts weren't just responding to my presence, they were responding to my attention. The cases I studied most carefully during my rounds showed the greatest irregularities. Those I merely glanced at remained stable. It was as if observation itself was feeding something within those ancient texts. I began to understand why the Rule of Seven existed. These weren't merely old books requiring preservation. They were something that required containment, and human presence was part of the containment protocol. The night keeper wasn't there to guard the manuscripts from theft or damage. The night keeper was there to keep them company. The revelation came during Holy Week, when I was conducting my 3 o'clock round. As I approached case 29, I heard something I'd been dreading for months, whispering. The case contained what appeared to be a devotional text, handwritten in medieval script. The words were in Latin, but as I leaned closer to the glass, I could hear voices, multiple voices reciting passages that weren't visible on the open pages. The sound was so faint it might have been ventilation or distant footsteps, but the rhythm was unmistakably that of prayer. I stood frozen as the whispers continued, realizing that I was listening to voices from within the manuscript itself. The environmental readings showed no change, but the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. My breath began to fog, though the thermostat read a steady 68 degrees. Then I noticed that other cases were beginning to respond. Case 15's manuscript, a collection of illuminated prayers, began to emit a soft rustling sound, as if pages were being turned by invisible hands. Case 41's bound volume appeared to be glowing faintly, though no light source could account for the phenomenon. As I stood there, surrounded by 47 cases of contained texts that were somehow alive, I understood the true nature of my assignment. These manuscripts contained something that required not just preservation, but active suppression. My nightly presence wasn't just monitoring it, was somehow necessary to keep them dormant. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. I could make out individual words now, Latin phrases that sounded like fragments of prayers or liturgical responses. But they were wrong somehow, inverted or incomplete, in ways that made my skin crawl. The voices weren't praising God. They were calling to something else entirely. I realized, with growing horror, that if I left my post, if I abandoned my vigil even for a moment, these things would fully awaken. The night keeper's presence was the final element in some ancient containment ritual, one that had been maintained for centuries by men who understood that certain knowledge was too dangerous to destroy, but too powerful to release. As dawn approached and the whispers gradually faded, I understood why Brother Francis had been reassigned so quietly. I understood why Brother Thomas counted the cases each morning, like a warden taking roll call. And I understood why the Rule of Seven existed, because these manuscripts didn't just contain forbidden knowledge. They contained something that was still very much alive. When Brother Thomas arrived that morning, he found me sitting in the center of the archive, surrounded by cases that had returned to their normal, silent state. He looked at my face and nodded slowly, as if recognizing something he'd seen before. "The vigil continues," he said simply. "I've been keeping the night watch for 2 years since that Holy Week revelation. The manuscripts still whisper occasionally, still shift and respond to my presence. But now I understand that my job isn't to prevent these disturbances, it's to witness them, to be present with whatever remains trapped in those ancient pages. Sometimes, when the whispers grow particularly insistent, I pray along with them, offering what comfort I can to whatever souls or spirits have been bound within that collection of forbidden texts. It's not an assignment anymore, it's a ministry to things that perhaps shouldn't exist, but do, and require the presence of living faith to keep them contained. The rule of 7 protects us all, though most will never know from what. In the winter of 1978, Father Marco Benedetti was assigned the late-night vigil duties in the Chapel of St. Lawrence. Built in the 13th century, this lesser-known chapel housed a magnificent fresco depicting the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, painted by an unknown Renaissance master, whose work had survived centuries of political upheaval and restoration attempts. Father Benedetti had always been a practical man, drawn more to theology than mysticism. His appointment to the Vatican had come through academic merit, rather than any particular spiritual revelation. The late-night vigils were meant to be peaceful times of prayer and contemplation, but from his very first evening in the chapel, something felt terribly wrong. It began with a soundless, soft, rhythmic dripping that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Father Benedetti initially dismissed it as a plumbing issue, common enough in a building complex dating back over a millennium. But as the nights passed, the sound grew more pronounced, and he began to notice something that made his blood run cold. The fresco of St. Lawrence appeared to be weeping. At first, he convinced himself it was condensation, perhaps caused by temperature fluctuations in the ancient stone structure. But the liquid was too viscous, too red. It trickled down from the painted eyes of the martyred saint in steady, crimson streams that pooled on the altar below. Father Benedetti reported the phenomenon to his superiors, but when maintenance crews arrived during daylight hours, they found nothing. The fresco was dry, pristine, showing no signs of the horrific weeping that plagued the night hours. His reports were met with polite concern and suggestions that perhaps the stress of his new position was affecting his perception. Determined to document the phenomenon, Father Benedetti began keeping detailed notes and attempted to photograph the weeping fresco. But his camera malfunctioned each time he tried to capture the image, producing only black, distorted photographs that looked as if they had been burned from within. On his 7th night in the chapel, the weeping intensified. The crimson tears now flowed like small rivers, and Father Benedetti swore he could hear whispers emanating from the painted figure. The words were in Latin, ancient and formal, but the message was clear: "Free me from this wall." As dawn broke on that 7th morning, Father Benedetti was found unconscious before the altar, his hands stained red. The fresco showed no signs of disturbance, but scratched into the stone floor beneath where he lay were deep gouges that spelled out a single word: Libertas. Father Benedetti was quietly transferred to a monastery in rural Italy, where he spent his remaining years refusing to speak of his time in the Chapel of St. Lawrence. The chapel was sealed permanently in 1979, officially due to structural concerns. Recent attempts to restore the building have been repeatedly delayed due to unexplained equipment failures and the sudden illness of workers assigned to the project. Sister Catherine Moreau arrived at Vatican City in 1965, one of the first women granted permission to work within the Apostolic Archive. Her expertise in medieval manuscripts was unparalleled, and she had been specifically requested to catalog a collection of illuminated texts dating back to the 8th century. Her work required late hours, as the ancient documents were sensitive to light and could only be examined under carefully controlled conditions. The small chapel adjacent to the archive, dedicated to St. Jerome, became her makeshift office during these nocturnal sessions. St. Jerome's chapel was a cramped, intimate space with room for perhaps 20 people. During the day, it was occasionally used for private prayers by Vatican staff, but at night, Sister Catherine had it entirely to herself for, so she believed. 3 weeks into her assignment, Sister Catherine began to notice that she was not alone during her late-night work sessions. At first, it was just a feeling the sensation of being watched, the subtle shift in temperature that suggested other human presence. But gradually, the signs became more tangible. She would arrive at the chapel to find the prayer kneelers slightly displaced, as if people had recently been using them. The scent of incense would linger in the air despite no recent services. Most disturbing of all, she began to hear the faint sound of Gregorian chanting, so soft it seemed to come from within the walls themselves. One night in October, working by lamplight on a particularly fragile 12th century psalter, Sister Catherine's concentration was broken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, measured footsteps that seemed to circle the small chapel. She looked up from her work to find the chapel filled with translucent figures, dozens of them, kneeling in prayer, their faces obscured by medieval monastic hoods. The apparitions seemed unaware of her presence, continuing their silent worship as if she were the ghost intruding upon their eternal vigil. Sister Catherine sat frozen, afraid that any movement might draw their attention. The figures remained for what felt like hours, their lips moving in soundless prayer, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the stained glass windows. As the morning light grew stronger, the figures gradually faded, dissolving like mist, until the chapel was empty once more. Sister Catherine confided in Father Giuseppe Toretti, the archives director, who listened to her account with grave concern. Father Toretti revealed that St. Jerome's Chapel had been built on the site of an earlier oratory that had been destroyed during the sack of Rome in 1527. Historical records indicated that a group of monks had barricaded themselves inside the original chapel during the attack, refusing to flee despite the approaching soldiers. They were found days later, having died of starvation, while maintaining their vigil of prayer. "It seems," Father Toretti said quietly, "that some prayers are so powerful they echo through eternity." Sister Catherine completed her cataloging work, but she was never again alone in St. Jerome's Chapel. Each night, the medieval congregation would materialize, maintaining their centuries-old vigil. She learned to work alongside them, finding strange comfort in their presence. But she never spoke to anyone else about her nightly companions, and when her assignment ended, she requested never to return to Vatican City. The chapel continues to be used for private prayers during the day, but Vatican policy now prohibits anyone from working there alone after sunset. Father Alessandro Conte had always possessed an unusual gift for hearing confessions. Penitents found themselves compelled to reveal their deepest secrets to him, unburdening themselves of sins they had carried for decades. His reputation for discretion and wisdom had earned him a coveted position at Vatican City, where he was assigned to hear confessions in the Chapel of the Sacred Heart, a small but ornate space frequented by Vatican staff and visiting clergy. The chapel's confessional was a work of art in itself, carved from dark walnut in the 17th century, with intricate religious scenes depicting various saints and martyrs. Father Conte took pride in maintaining the ancient booth, polishing the wood and ensuring the privacy screens remained intact. But in the autumn of 1983, something changed. Father Conte began to hear confessions from penitents who weren't there. It started subtly. He would be alone in the confessional, preparing for the evening's appointments, when he would hear a whispered voice from the other side of the screen. The voice would begin a confession in archaic Italian, recounting sins that seemed to belong to another era entirely. When Father Conte would respond, offering guidance or absolution, the voice would simply stop, leaving him speaking to empty air. As the weeks passed, the phantom confessions became more frequent and more disturbing. The invisible penitent spoke of crimes that spanned centuries, corruption within the church hierarchy, murders committed in the name of faith, the betrayal of sacred trusts. Most troubling of all, the confessions often contained specific details about historical events that Father Conte had never studied, information that proved accurate when he later researched the claims. One evening in November, as Father Conte prepared to close the chapel for the night, he heard the most chilling confession yet. The voice was different this time, younger, more frightened. It belonged to a boy, perhaps 10 years old, speaking in a dialect of Italian that hadn't been used for over 300 years. "Father," the child's voice whispered, "I must tell you what Cardinal Torriani did to us in the crypt. He said it was God's will, but it wasn't. Was it, Father? It couldn't have been." Father Conte's blood ran cold. Cardinal Torriani had been a powerful figure in the 17th century Vatican, known for his theological writings and charitable works. But as the boy's confession continued, detailing horrific abuses committed by the cardinal and covered up by church officials, Father Conte realized he was hearing the testimony of one of Torriani's victims, a child who had died over 3 centuries ago without ever receiving justice. "He's still here, Father," the boy's voice continued, "in the crypt beneath the chapel. He's still doing those things to the children who come to him. You have to stop him." Father Conte investigated the chapel's history and discovered that it had indeed been built over an older crypt, sealed during renovations in 1692. The official records showed that Cardinal Torriani had died that same year and was buried in the crypt, which had been permanently closed for structural reasons. Unable to ignore what he had heard, Father Conte petitioned his superiors for permission to examine the sealed crypt. His request was denied, but late one night, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain, he found his way to the old entrance in the chapel's basement. The crypt had been sealed with blessed concrete and iron, but centuries of settling had created small gaps in the barrier. Through one of these openings, Father Conte could see into the tomb below. What he witnessed there shadows that moved with deliberate purpose, the faint sounds of children crying, and worst of all, the fresh flowers that someone or something continued to place on Cardinal Torriani's tomb convinced him that the boy's confession had been true. Father Conte was found the next morning, catatonic, clutching a piece of parchment covered in 17th century script. The document was a confession signed by Cardinal Torriani himself, admitting to his crimes and begging for forgiveness. Experts confirmed that the ink and parchment were authentic to the period, but no one could explain how Father Conte had obtained it. Father Conte never fully recovered from his experience. He was quietly transferred to a monastery in Sicily, where he spent his remaining years in contemplative silence. The Chapel of the Sacred Heart was renovated shortly afterward, and a new confessional was installed. But staff members continued to report hearing whispered voices in the chapel after hours, and the confession schedule now explicitly prohibits appointments after sunset. In 1994, the Vatican commissioned Maria Rossetti, a renowned fresco restoration artist, to restore a series of 16th century paintings in the Chapel of San Pellegrino. The chapel, one of the smallest in Vatican City, had been damaged by a minor earthquake the previous year, causing several of the ancient frescoes to crack and fade. Maria was thrilled by the assignment. The frescoes, depicting scenes from the life of Saint Pellegrino, were attributed to the school of Raphael and represented some of the finest religious art of the Renaissance. Her job was to carefully clean the paintings and repair the damage without altering the original artist's vision. She established her workspace in the chapel, bringing in scaffolding, lights, and the specialized tools of her trade. The work was meticulous and solitary, requiring complete focus and an intimate knowledge of Renaissance painting techniques. On her third day in the chapel, while cleaning a fresco depicting Saint Pellegrino's miraculous healing of the sick, Maria noticed something odd. Hidden beneath centuries of dirt and candle smoke was an additional figura man standing in the background of the scene, watching the saint with an expression of profound malevolence. The figure had been deliberately obscured, painted over with layers of pigment that matched the surrounding background. As Maria carefully removed the concealing paint, she revealed a masterfully executed portrait of a man in medieval dress, his face twisted with rage and his eyes seeming to follow the viewer's movement around the chapel. Intrigued by the discovery, Maria researched the chapel's history. She learned that the original frescoes had been commissioned by Pope Julius II, but had been mysteriously altered several times over the centuries. Different popes had ordered sections to be repainted, but the records were vague about why these changes had been necessary. As Maria continued her work, uncovering more of the hidden figure, she began to experience disturbing dreams. In these dreams, she was painting in the chapel, but instead of restoration work, she was adding new elements to the fresco's dark, twisted additions that transformed the holy scenes into nightmarish visions of suffering and despair. The dreams became so vivid that Maria began to question whether they were dreams at all. She would arrive at the chapel in the morning to find fresh paint on her brushes, paint that she couldn't remember using. Small details in the frescoes appeared to have been altered overnight. A saint's expression would be slightly more anguished, or a background element would be subtly more menacing. The breakthrough came when Maria discovered a hidden compartment in the chapel's altar. Inside, she found the journal of Giuliano de' Medici, the original artist who had painted the frescoes in the 16th century. The journal revealed that de' Medici had been commissioned not just to paint religious scenes, but to create a spiritual trapaway to contain the malevolent spirit of a heretical monk who had been executed in the chapel centuries earlier. The hidden figure that Maria had been uncovering was the monk himself, painted into the fresco as a form of supernatural imprisonment. But the journal's final entries grew increasingly erratic, describing how the monk's spirit had begun to influence de' Medici's work, forcing him to paint scenes of torment and blasphemy that corrupted the holy images. "He speaks to me through the brush," de' Medici had written. "Each stroke of paint binds him deeper into the wall, but also gives him more power over my hand. I fear I am becoming his instrument, painting horrors that should never see the light of day. God forgive me, I cannot stop." Maria realized with growing horror that by restoring the hidden figure, she was weakening the spiritual bonds that contained the monk's malevolent presence. But she found herself unable to stop her work, compelled by a force she couldn't resist to continue uncovering the painted prison. On her final night in the chapel, Maria completed the restoration of the hidden figure. As she put the finishing touches on the monk's face, she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she saw the figure from the fresco standing in the chapel, no longer bound by paint and plaster, but free to walk among the living once more. The monk smiled at her with genuine gratitude before vanishing into the shadows of Vatican City. Maria Rossetti was found the next morning, alive but forever changed. Her hair had turned white overnight, and she spoke only in Latin for several weeks following her discovery. The frescoes in the chapel of San Pellegrino were painted over completely, replaced with simple geometric patterns. The chapel is no longer used for religious services, and serves only as a storage space for maintenance equipment. Maria Rossetti never worked on another religious painting, dedicating the remainder of her career to secular subjects. But those close to her noticed that she never again painted human faces, claiming that she could no longer trust her brush not to give them life. In the winter of 1978, Father Alessandro Torretti was assigned night watch duties at the Chapel of San Lorenzo, a small sanctuary tucked away in the deepest recesses of Vatican City. Built in the 13th century, the chapel housed a marble statue of the Virgin Mary that had been blessed by 3 different popes throughout its history. What Father Torretti discovered during his first week would shake his faith to its very core. It began with whispers. Every night at precisely 3:17 a.m., Father Torretti heard what sounded like hushed conversations echoing through the chapel's stone corridors. At first, he attributed the sounds to the old building settling or perhaps pilgrims praying in nearby chambers. But as the nights progressed, the whispers grew more distinct, more urgent. "She sees everything," the voices would murmur. "She knows what lies beneath." Father Torretti's investigation led him to examine the chapel's history more closely. In the Vatican's restricted archives, he discovered a disturbing pattern. Every priest assigned to San Lorenzo's night watch over the past century had requested immediate transfer within 6 months. Many had left the priesthood entirely. One had been found dead in his cell, aged beyond recognition despite being only 35 years old. The breakthrough came on his 7th night of duty. As the clock struck 3:17 a.m., Father Torretti positioned himself directly beneath the Madonna statue, determined to locate the source of the whispers. What he witnessed defied all rational explanation. The marble eyes of the Virgin began to weep not tears of water, but thick, dark rivulets that looked disturbingly like blood. But it wasn't the weeping that terrified him most. It was what he saw reflected in those crimson tears. The chapel floor seemed to become transparent, revealing a vast underground chamber filled with dozens of stone sarcophagi. Inside each coffin lay the decomposing remains of children, their small hands folded in eternal prayer. Some wore the distinctive robes of altar boys from centuries past. Others were dressed in the simple clothes of peasant children. As Father Toretti watched in horror, the whispers intensified, and he began to understand their source. These were the voices of the children below, calling out for justice that would never come. The Madonna wept for them, her tears carrying their pain up through the stone to bear witness to their forgotten suffering. The vision lasted only minutes, but its impact was permanent. Father Toretti's hair had turned completely white by morning. He submitted his transfer request immediately, but not before leaving a detailed account sealed in the chapel's record book, a warning for whoever might replace him. The chapel of San Lorenzo remains active today, though it now requires 2 priests for night duty. Neither is allowed to remain alone with the Madonna after midnight. The official Vatican explanation for this policy is security concerns. But those who know the truth understand the real reason. The Madonna still weeps at 3:17 a.m. Some say if you listen carefully, you can still hear the children's whispers echoing through the ancient stone. Cardinal Eugenio Benedetti was known throughout Vatican City for his extraordinary ability to hear confessions. Pilgrims would travel from across the globe specifically to confess their sins to him in the ornate confessional booth of the Chapel of St. Augustine. What they didn't know was that Cardinal Benedetti possessed a terrible gift tone that would ultimately consume him. The cardinal could hear not only the sins people confessed, but also the sins they desperately tried to hide. It started gradually. During routine confessions, Cardinal Benedetti began experiencing vivid flashes of his parishioners' darkest secrets. A businessman confessing to lying about his taxes would trigger visions of the man's involvement in human trafficking. A young woman seeking forgiveness for adultery would unknowingly reveal her role in her sister's death years earlier. At first, the cardinal believed these visions were divine revelations, God's way of ensuring true absolution. He began pressing confessors for details about their hidden sins, convincing himself he was saving their souls. But the visions grew stronger, more intrusive, and infinitely more disturbing. The breaking point came during the confession of Sister Maria Celestine, a nun from a local convent known for her charitable work. As she knelt in the booth confessing minor transgressions, Cardinal Benedetti was overwhelmed by a vision so horrific it left him physically ill. He saw Sister Maria, as a young woman, systematically poisoning elderly patients in a hospital where she had worked before taking her vows. Dozens of deaths, all attributed to natural causes, all committed by the woman now seeking absolution for unkind thoughts. When Cardinal Benedetti confronted her with his knowledge, Sister Maria's reaction confirmed his worst fears. She smiled at a cold, calculating expression that had nothing to do with religious devotion. "So the stories are true," she whispered through the confessional screen. "You really can see into our souls. How unfortunate for you." That night, Cardinal Benedetti found himself unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he was bombarded with visions of the hidden sins of everyone who had ever confessed to him. Murder, abuse, betrayal, corruption, the accumulated evil of thousands of confessions crashed over him like a dark tide. By the 3rd sleepless night, the cardinal realized the truth. The confessional booth itself was cursed. Built in the 15th century from wood taken from the Inquisition's torture chambers, it had absorbed centuries of forced confessions extracted through agony and terror. The booth didn't just hear sins, it hunted them, compelling truth from even the most guarded hearts. Cardinal Benedetti's final journal entry, discovered after his death, revealed the horrifying culmination of his gift. "I understand now why God allows evil to hide in plain sight. Some truths are too terrible for mortal minds to bear. I have seen into the abyss of human nature, and it has seen into me. The confessional demands its price for revealing such secrets. It wants my soul in exchange for the knowledge it has given me." The cardinal was found dead in the confessional booth 3 days later. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his hands clawing at his throat as if he had been strangling himself. The booth's wooden screen was cracked down the middle, split from the inside as if by some enormous pressure. The chapel of St. Augustine closed the confessional permanently after Cardinal Benedetti's death, but late-night security guards report hearing whispered confessions still emanating from the sealed booth. Sometimes, they claim, the whispers are in languages that predate Christianity itself. In 1992, Father Michael Donovan, an American priest on sabbatical in Vatican City, was granted permission to study medieval manuscripts in the restricted archives. His research focused on accounts of miraculous missa services where divine intervention was said to have occurred. What Father Donovan discovered about the Chapel Sancti Spiritus would challenge everything he believed about the nature of faith and damnation. The chapel was mentioned in several 14th-century documents as the site of Masses most sacred and terrible, but the details were frustratingly vague. Father Donovan's breakthrough came when he discovered a hidden compartment in one of the ancient Texa compartment containing the complete confession of Brother Thomas Aquilonius, sealed away for over 600 years. Brother Thomas had been assigned as the chapel's caretaker in 1347 during the height of the Black Death. As plague ravaged Europe and faith wavered, desperate souls flocked to Vatican City seeking salvation. The Chapel Sancti Spiritus, with its reputation for miraculous healings, drew the most desperate cases, people willing to trade anything for divine intervention. According to Brother Thomas's confession, the chapel's priest, Father Malphus, offered these desperate souls a special midnight mass. He claimed it was an ancient ritual that could guarantee salvation, no matter how grave one's sins. The only requirement was absolute secrecy and complete faith. Father Donovan was disturbed by the confession's description of these midnight masses. Attendees were required to bring offerings, not money or food, but something far more precious. A beloved memory, a cherished relationship, a fundamental aspect of their identity. Father Malphus claimed these sacrifices proved their devotion to God. But Brother Thomas had hidden in the chapel one night to witness the ritual, and what he saw revealed the truth behind the miraculous healings. The midnight mass was indeed powerful, but it wasn't divine intervention that cured the attendees. Father Malphus had somehow formed a pact with something ancient and hungry, an entity that fed on human experience and emotion. In exchange for the spiritual sustenance provided by the attendees' sacrifices, this entity would heal their physical ailments. The cured pilgrims left the chapel healthy in body, but fundamentally changed. They had given away pieces of their souls in exchange for corporeal healing. Some could no longer remember their children's faces. Others forgot how to feel love or compassion. Many retained their memories but lost the emotional connection to them, becoming hollow vessels wearing human faces. Brother Thomas's confession described his growing horror as he realized the scope of Father Malphus's operation. Hundreds of people had attended these midnight masses over the years. All were physically healed, but all had lost essential parts of their humanity in the exchange. The confession ended abruptly with Brother Thomas's decision to confront Father Malphus. The next entry was written in different handwriting, a note explaining that Brother Thomas had died of plague within days of sealing his testimony. Father Donovan's investigation into the chapel's current status revealed disturbing continuities. The Chapel Sancti Spiritus remained active, though official records claimed it hadn't held regular services since the 16th century. Yet security logs showed mysterious gatherings occurring in the chapel on the new moon of each month, always between midnight and dawn, always with the same group of attendees. Driven by academic curiosity and growing dread, Father Donovan attended one of these gatherings. What he witnessed confirmed his worst fears. The midnight mass was still being conducted, led by a priest whose face seemed to shift in the candlelight, never quite maintaining a consistent appearance. The attendees were modern pilgrims, cancer patients, grieving parents, people facing terminal diagnosis, all drawn by whispered promises of miraculous healing. The ritual proceeded exactly as Brother Thomas had described centuries earlier. Each attendee offered their sacrificia. Dying woman gave up her memory of her wedding day, in exchange for 5 more years of life. A young father surrendered his ability to feel joy, so his daughter's leukemia would go into remission. Father Donovan tried to intervene, to warn the attendees of what they were truly sacrificing, but found himself unable to speak or move. He could only watch as each person traded away pieces of their soul for physical healing. The priester, the entity wearing the priest's form, noticed Father Donovan's presence and smiled with too many teeth. "Another witness," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "How delightful! You seek to understand our work, yes? Come forward, Father Donovan. See how we heal the faithful." Father Donovan's journal, discovered in his Vatican apartment 3 days later, ended with a single, terrifying realization. "I understand now why the Church has allowed this to continue. The entity keeps meticulous records. It knows exactly which soul fragments it has collected and from whom. The Vatican tolerates this arrangement because it provides ultimate leverage over hundreds of influential people who have traded away parts of themselves for healing. They are bound to the Church not by faith, but by the terrible knowledge that their missing pieces can only be found here, in this cursed chapel." Father Donovan disappeared shortly after writing this entry. Official Vatican records state he returned to America to care for his ailing mother, but no trace of him has ever been found there. The Chapel Sancti Spiritus continues its monthly gatherings. Security guards are instructed to avoid the area during new moon nights, and the chapel's maintenance is performed only during daylight hours by staff members who have undergone extensive psychological screening. They say if you know where to look, you can still see the attendees of these midnight masses throughout Vatican City physically whole but spiritually incomplete, their eyes holding an emptiness that no amount of faith can fill. Father Alessandro had served at the Vatican for 37 years, but he'd never experienced anything like what happened in the Chapel of St. Lawrence that October evening. The ancient confessional booth, carved from Lebanese cedar in 1623, had been the site of countless absolutions. What the records didn't mention was that it had also witnessed 3 mysterious deaths over the centuries. Each confessor found slumped over, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. The trouble began when Cardinal Toretti assigned Father Alessandro to hear confessions during the chapel's restoration. Just temporary, the cardinal had assured him, though his eyes avoided Alessandro's gaze, until we can relocate the regular services. On his first evening, Alessandro noticed the unusual weight of silence that seemed to press against the confessional's wooden walls. The booth itself felt colder than the rest of the chapel, despite the October warmth outside. As he settled into his seat, running his fingers over the worn Latin inscriptions carved into the armrest, he felt an odd sensation as if someone were already there, waiting on the other side of the partition. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," came a voice, barely above a whisper. Alessandro's blood chilled. The voice was his own. He looked through the partition's small window. The other side was empty, yet he could hear breathing that perfectly matched his own rhythm. When he held his breath, the sound stopped. When he exhaled, so did the presence. "Who's there?" Alessandro managed, his voice cracking. "You know who I am," the voice replied, still in his exact tone and inflection. "I am every sin you've absorbed, every darkness you've taken into yourself through these walls." Over the following nights, the encounters grew more intense. The voice would confess Alessandro's own childhood transgressions, stealing coins from his mother's purse, lying to his seminary professors, the moments of doubt about his faith that he'd never shared with another soul. But worse were the confessions of sins Alessandro had never committed, yet described in such vivid detail that he began to question his own memory. "I murdered the altar boy behind San Pietro," the voice confessed on the 5th night. "I buried him beneath the rose garden, where the cardinals take their morning walks." Alessandro knew this was impossible. He'd been assigned to a rural parish during his early years, nowhere near Rome. Yet the voice provided details. The boy's name, Marco Benedetti, the date, June 15th, 1987, even the specific garden plot, 3rd row, beneath the white climbing roses. Driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain, Alessandro researched the confession. To his horror, he discovered that Marco Benedetti, a 12-year-old altar server, had indeed disappeared on that exact date. His body was never found. On the seventh night, Alessandro entered the confessional, determined to end whatever was happening. He'd brought holy water, blessed salt, and his grandfather's rosary worn smooth by decades of prayer. But as he sat down, he realized something fundamental had changed. He was no longer hearing the confessions. He was giving them. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," he heard himself say, though he hadn't intended to speak. His hands moved to the small window, and through it, he saw his own face staring back but wrong somehow. The features subtly rearranged, the eyes holding centuries of accumulated guilt. "Tell me your sins," the other Alessandro said. And Father Alessandro found himself confessing not just his own transgressions, but those of every penitent who had ever knelt in that booth. Hours pastor, perhaps centurises, he unburdened himself of murders, betrayals, and blasphemies that belonged to others yet felt like his own. When dawn broke, the maintenance crew found Father Alessandro slumped in the confessional, his face locked in the same expression of terror as his three predecessors. But, unlike the others, Alessandro was still breathing barely. He spent 6 months in a Vatican medical facility, speaking only to repeat the same phrase: "The sins are still there, waiting for the next confessor." The chapel of St. Lawrence was quietly deconsecrated. The confessional booth was dismantled and burned, though witnesses reported that the flames turned an unnatural shade of purple and cast shadows that moved independently of the fire. Father Alessandro eventually recovered enough to return to service, but he never again entered a confessional booth. When asked why, he would only say, "Some voices are too dangerous to listen to, even in the name of forgiveness." Dr. Elena Marchetti had always prided herself on being a rational woman. As the Vatican's lead art restoration specialist, she approached her work with scientific precision and scholarly detachment. So when she discovered the hidden fresco beneath Michelangelo's The Last Judgment, she initially dismissed the strange sensations that accompanied the find as simple excitement over the discovery. The anomaly first appeared during routine maintenance. While examining a small area where the paint had begun to flake, Elena noticed an unusual underlying layer. Using careful chemical analysis and microscopic examination, she determined that another complete fresco lay beneath Michelangelo's masterpiece that predated the Sistine Chapel itself. Vatican authorities granted her unprecedented access to investigate. Working alone during the early morning hours when the chapel was closed to visitors, Elena began the painstaking process of uncovering small sections of the hidden artwork. What she found defied explanation. The underlying fresco depicted the same biblical scene as Michelangelo's work, The Final Judgment, but with disturbing differences. The figures were anatomically impossible, their limbs twisted at angles that hurt to observe. Christ sat in judgment, but his face held an expression of cruel satisfaction rather than divine justice. The saved and the damned were indistinguishable. All bore expressions of absolute terror. More unsettling was the fresco's apparent age. Carbon dating suggested it was painted in 1473, 15 years before the chapel's construction began. Yet it perfectly matched the chapel's dimensions and architectural features. Elena worked in 2-hour shifts, uncovering inch by careful inch. She documented everything meticulously, photographing each revealed section, taking notes on the impossible pigments that seemed to shimmer and move in the corner of her vision. But as the days passed, she began to notice changes in the photographs. Figures that appeared static while she worked seemed to have shifted positions between photo sessions. A damned soul's hand that pointed downward in Tuesday's photographs was reaching upward by Thursday. The Christ figure's eyes, which initially looked toward the masses below, gradually turned to look directly at the camera, directly at Elena. By the second week, Elena found herself staying longer each day, sometimes forgetting to eat or sleep. The hidden fresco had become an obsession. She began arriving at the chapel before dawn and leaving only when exhaustion forced her to stop. Her colleagues expressed concern, but Elena barely heard them. She was consumed by a single question: who had painted this impossible artwork? The answer came during her third week of work. Hidden in the lower right corner, in the space traditionally reserved for the artist's signature, Elena found a name painted in letters so small they were barely visible. Elena Marchetti, 1473. She stared at her own name, rendered in 15th century pigments, written in a hand she didn't recognize yet, somehow knew intimately. The date was impossible. She hadn't been born until 1982, yet there it was, undeniably real. That night, Elena dreamed she was painting the fresco. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, mixing pigments that didn't exist, applying techniques that hadn't been invented. In the dream, she understood that she had always been painting this fresco, that she would always be painting it, trapped in an endless cycle of creation and discovery. She woke with paint under her fingernails. Elena stopped coming to work. She ignored calls from her supervisors, refused to answer her apartment door. For 3 days, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at her hands and trying to remember when she had learned to mix ultramarine with ground human bone to achieve that particular shade of blue. On the 4th day, compelled by forces she couldn't resist, Elena returned to the chapel. She found that more of the fresco had been uncovered sections she was certain she hadn't yet reached. The work was perfect, executed with a skill that exceeded her own abilities. In the newly revealed areas, she found more signatures. Elena Marchetti, 1503. Elena Marchetti, 1876. Elena Marchetti, 1923. Each signature was in her handwriting, yet none were written by her hand. The Vatican quietly reassigned Elena to a monastery library in rural Umbria, citing exhaustion and stress. The hidden fresco was sealed beneath a new layer of protective coating, though rumors persist among the restoration staff that it continues to change, that new sections appear without human intervention. Elena spends her days now cataloging medieval manuscripts, her hands steady and sure as she handles ancient texts. But sometimes, late at night, she finds herself sketching impossible figures with anatomically incorrect proportions, using techniques she doesn't remember learning. And sometimes, when the moon is dark and the monastery is silent, she can swear she hears the sound of brushes against wet plaster, coming from the direction of the Sistine Chapel, hundreds of miles away. Brother Marcus had walked the night shifts at the Vatican for 12 years, his soft-soled shoes silent against the ancient marble floors. As a member of the Swiss Guard's Special Security Division, he knew every shadow, every sound that the Holy City made in its sleep. The papal tombs beneath St. Peter's Basilica had always been part of his route, a quick sweep through the grottos to ensure all was secure before continuing his rounds. But on the night of November 20, All Souls' Day, Marcus discovered that the dead don't always rest quietly. His first indication that something was wrong came at 2:47 a.m. when he noticed candlelight flickering in the chapel of St. Petronilla, deep within the necropolis. The chapel was supposed to be sealed, no tourists, no late-night tours, no reason for illumination. Yet soft golden light danced against the ancient walls, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Marcus approached cautiously, hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt. But as he drew closer, he heard something that made him freeze, the low murmur of Latin prayers, spoken in unison by multiple voices. It was the rhythm of Mass, but conducted in whispers that seemed to come from beneath the stone floor itself. Through the chapel's entrance, Marcus saw them. Figures in papal vestments knelt before the altar, their backs to him, heads bowed in prayer. At first glance, they appeared to be living men, cardinals or bishops, conducting some secret midnight service. But as his eyes adjusted to the candlelight, Marcus noticed details that sent ice through his veins. The figures were translucent, their forms wavering like heat mirages. Their vestments, while magnificent, belonged to different eras. Some wore the elaborate robes of Renaissance popes, others the simpler garments of early Christian bishops. And when they moved, they made no sound beyond their whispered prayers. Marcus counted 13 figures, all papal regalia, all kneeling in perfect formation before an altar that shouldn't exist. The chapel of St. Petronilla contained no altar, only ancient sarcophagi and memorial plaques. Yet there it stood, carved from what appeared to be black marble, its surface gleaming with an inner light. The figure at the center taller than the others, wearing a triple crown that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the candle, light slowly turned his head. Marcus found himself staring into the face of Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope who had died 5 centuries earlier. The pontiff's features were exactly as depicted in Renaissance paintings, but his eyes held depths that no artist had ever captured, depths that seemed to contain all the accumulated sins of papal history. "Welcome, Brother Marcus," Alexander VI, his voice carrying clearly despite being barely above a whisper. "We have been waiting for you to join our eternal vigil." Marcus tried to step backward but found his feet rooted to the stone floor. The other papal figures had turned as well, their faces representing a parade of church history. Urban VI, whose cruelty had nearly destroyed the papacy. Benedict IX, who had sold the papal throne. Sergius III, accused of murder and adultery. Each face was perfectly preserved in death, but animated by something that should not have been possible. "Every All Souls' Day," Pope Alexander continued, "we gather to confess the sins we committed in life, the corruption we brought to Christ's church. We seek absolution, but no priest can grant forgiveness to those who claim to speak for God while serving darker masters." The candles around the altar flared higher, and Marcus saw that the altar was not carved from marble at all. It was built from human bones. Yellowed femurs formed the base, rib cages created intricate archways, and thousands of finger bones spelled out Latin inscriptions too blasphemous to comprehend. "Each night we pray," said Pope Benedict IX, his boyish features twisted by centuries of remorse. "Each night we confess. Each night we receive no answer from heaven." Marcus found his voice. What do you want from me?" Pope Urban VI smiled, the expression terrible on his ancient features. "We want you to bear witness. For 500 years, we have conducted these masses in secret, watched only by shadows and stone. But the living world above grows more corrupt, and we fear our vigil is no longer sufficient. We need a living soul to carry our confession to the world." "I can't," Marcus began, but the words died in his throat, as the 13 popes began to rise in unison. As they stood, their translucent forms became more solid, more real, until Marcus could smell the incense that clung to their ancient vestments and hear the whisper of silk against stone. "You have already seen," Pope Alexander VI said. "You have already heard. The choice is no longer yours to make." The popes began to move toward Marcus, their procession slow but inexorable. As they approached, Marcus felt memories that weren't his own flooding his mind. Papal orgies in the Vatican apartments, murders committed in the name of church politics, deals struck with princes and devils alike. He experienced every corrupt act, every abuse of power, every betrayal of sacred trust, as if he had committed them himself. When dawn broke, the security chief found Marcus kneeling before the sealed entrance to the chapel of St. Petronilla, his face streaked with tears, clutching a rosary that hadn't been in his possession when his shift began. He was conscious but unresponsive, his lips moving in continuous Latin prayer. Marcus never resumed his duties with the Swiss Guard. He was quietly transferred to a monastery in the Alps, where he spends his days in silence and his nights in prayer. But every November 20, he disappears from his cell, and the other monks report seeing a lone figure walking the mountain paths at midnight, carrying candles and speaking Latin words to the darkness. The chapel of St. Petronilla remains sealed, but maintenance workers occasionally report the smell of incense and the sound of whispered prayers emanating from beyond the locked doors. The Vatican's official position is that these are merely echo-souled stones, remembering ancient rituals. But Brother Marcus, when he speaks at all, tells a different story. He says the masses continue every night, that the dead popes still gather to confess their sins to an empty heaven. And he warns that someday, when the world's corruption reaches a critical mass, the papal dead will no longer be content with midnight vigils in forgotten chapels. They will rise to judge the living church they helped corrupt. Dr. Sarah Chen had dedicated her life to preserving the written word. As the Vatican Secret Archive's youngest senior researcher, she had access to documents that most scholars could only dream of examining. Medieval manuscripts, papal bulls, correspondence between saints and sinners, all carefully catalogued and preserved in climate-controlled chambers beneath the Vatican. But some texts, Sarah discovered, have a life of their own. The manuscript arrived on a Tuesday morning in December, delivered by a cardinal who seemed eager to leave it in Sarah's care and depart quickly. The document itself appeared unremarkable medieval codex, bound in cracked leather, its vellum pages yellowed but intact. The accompanying note identified it as Librum Viventium, the Book of the Living, supposedly written by an unknown monk in the year 1347. Sarah's first task was authentication. She photographed each page, carefully documenting the illuminated capitals and marginalia that decorated the Latin text. The subject matter appeared to be a theological treatise on the nature of eternal life, but the language was unusually dense, filled with theological concepts she didn't recognize, despite her advanced degree in medieval studies. It was during her third day of examination that Sarah noticed the first anomaly. A passage she had photographed on Monday had changed. Where the text had originally read, Vita aeterna est donum Dei, eternal life is God's gift, it now read, Vita aeterna est poena Dei, eternal life is God's punishment. Sarah checked her photographs. They showed the original text clearly, yet the manuscript itself displayed the altered version. Initially, Sarah suspected her own memory. Medieval Latin could be challenging, and she might have simply misread the passage. But when she returned the next morning, she found an entire paragraph had been added to page 43, written in the same ink, the same handwriting, but describing events that had occurred the previous evening in her own apartment. The new text read, Puella Sarah, dubitat de requam vide, nocte hesterna sedens apud mensam in cubiculo suo, quaerit responsiones, in libris qui non possunt loqui. Sed liber qui vivit observat eam, et scribit de eius timoribus. The girl Sarah doubts what she sees. Last night, sitting at the table in her room, she seeks answers in books that cannot speak. But the living book watches her and writes of her fears. Sarah's hands trembled as she read her own activities, described in 13th century Latin. She was certain, absolutely certain, that this passage had not existed the day before. Over the following weeks, the manuscript continued to change. New passages appeared nightly, all describing Sarah's daily activities in meticulous detail. The book knew when she woke, what she ate for breakfast, which colleagues she spoke with. More disturbing were the passages that described her thoughts and emotions with uncanny accuracy. Sarah began staying late in the archives, determined to catch the manuscript in the act of transformation. She set up cameras, positioned herself where she could observe the book continuously, even tried sleeping in the archive chamber. But the changes seemed to occur only when she wasn't looking, as if the manuscript was aware of her attention. The content of the new passages gradually shifted from mere observation to commentary. The unknown monk's voice for Sarah had begun to think of the manuscript's additions as authored by some medieval consciousness began offering opinions about her life. Sarah Chen seeks truth in dead words, but she fears the truth that lives. She has chosen books over human connection, knowledge over love. The living text shows her the emptiness of her existence. Sarah tried to dismiss these additions as psychological projections. Perhaps she was unconsciously modifying the manuscript herself during moments of fatigue or stress. But when she requested colleagues to observe the text, they confirmed the changes. More disturbing still, They could read passages that described their own private moments, their own secret thoughts and fears. Dr. Martinelli, the head archivist, found his marital problems detailed in elegant Latin verse. Professor Rodriguez discovered entries describing childhood traumas she had never shared with anyone. Each person who examined the manuscript found themselves reflected in its pages, their most intimate secrets laid bare in medieval script. The manuscript's influence began extending beyond the Vatican walls. Sarah started receiving calls from family members and friends, all reporting strange experiences. Her sister in Boston called to describe a dream in which she had been speaking Latina language she didn't know. Her former professor at Harvard sent worried emails about vivid memories of medieval monasteries he had never visited. The connections became clear when Sarah found new passages describing these very conversations, written in the manuscript hours before they occurred. The book wasn't just recording the presented, was somehow reaching into the future, documenting events that hadn't yet happened. On the manuscript's final night, in Sarah's care, she discovered the most disturbing addition yet. A new section had appeared, written in her own handwriting but in perfect medieval Latin far, beyond her actual skill in the language. The passage described how she would, that very evening, take the manuscript to her apartment, place it on her kitchen table, and begin copying its contents by hand. Sarah had made no such plans. She intended to secure the manuscript in the archive's vault and request its transfer to the Vatican's Supernatural Research Division. But as she read the passage, she felt an overwhelming compulsion to do exactly what it described. Fighting against the urge, Sarah locked the manuscript in the secure vault and left the archives. But she found herself driving not toward home, but back to the Vatican. Her hands seemed to move independently as she entered her security code, descended to the vault, and retrieved the book. At her apartment, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with pens and paper, her hands beginning to copy the manuscript's text. As she wrote, she understood that she was not transcribing the book, she was becoming part of it. Each word she copied inscribed itself not just on paper, but into her consciousness. The Vatican security cameras recorded Sarah working through the night, but the footage showed disturbing anomalies. Sometimes she appeared to be copying from blank pages. Other times, multiple versions of Sarah seemed to be writing simultaneously, their movements perfectly synchronized. By dawn, dozens of Sarah figures filled her apartment, all writing, all copying the same impossible text. When colleagues found Sarah 3 days later, she was sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by thousands of pages of handwritten Latin. She was conscious, but unresponsive, her hands still moving across the paper in continuous writing motions, though her pen had long since run dry. The original manuscript was found open to a new final page, written in Sarah's handwriting. Dr. Sarah Chen has joined the living text. Her knowledge is now our knowledge. Her existence, now our existence. We are the words that write themselves, the story that tells itself, the book that lives forever. Sarah was quietly admitted to a private medical facility, where she remains today. She speaks only in medieval Latin, recounting the lives of people who died centuries ago, as if she had known them personally. Sometimes, she describes future events with perfect accuracy, though she shows no awareness of the present moment. The Librum Viventium was sealed away in the Vatican's most secure chamber, but reports suggest it continues to change. Maintenance workers describe seeing lights in the sealed room, hearing the sound of writing, and occasionally finding new documents slipped under the chamber door, all describing current events at the Vatican, all written in Sarah's distinctive handwriting. The official church position is that Dr. Chen suffered a psychological breakdown brought on by overwork and isolation. But her former colleagues whisper a different explanation. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. Some texts too alive to remain safely bound between covers. And in the depths of the Vatican's secret archives, behind triple-locked doors and holy seals, the sound of writing continues day and night, endless and patient, as the living book adds new chapters to its ever-growing chronicle of human existence. Father Giuseppe Toretti had always prided himself on his rational approach to faith. As a Vatican archivist specializing in medieval religious art, he spent his days cataloging centuries-old manuscripts and documenting the restoration of priceless frescoes. But nothing in his scholarly background could have prepared him for what he would encounter in the Chapel of San Lorenzo during the winter of 2019. The chapel, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the Apostolic Palace, housed a remarkable 13th-century fresco depicting the martyrdom of St. Lawrence. The artwork had been scheduled for restoration after decades of neglect had left it faded and cracking. Father Toretti was assigned to oversee the project, ensuring that every detail was properly documented before the restoration team began their delicate work. It was during his third evening alone with the fresco that he first noticed something unusual. The chapel, lit only by a single fluorescent work lamp, cast harsh shadows across the ancient walls. As Father Toretti photographed sections of the deteriorating painting, he noticed what appeared to be moisture seeping from the eyes of St. Lawrence in the fresco. Initially, he attributed this to condensation or a leak in the chapel's aging infrastructure. The Vatican's ancient buildings were notorious for their maintenance issues. He made a note to contact the building services department in the morning and continued his work. But the next evening, the moisture had returned, and this time, it appeared to be spreading. Thin, dark streaks ran from the saint's eyes down the wall, staining the centuries-old plaster. More disturbing still, the liquid had an unusual consistency, thicker than water, with a faint reddish tinge that became more pronounced in the harsh lighting. Father Toretti collected samples of the substance and had them analyzed by the Vatican's conservation lab. The results were inconclusive. The liquid contained traces of minerals consistent with old building materials, but also organic compounds that the lab technicians couldn't identify. As the days passed, the weeping intensified. Each morning, Father Toretti would arrive to find fresh streaks running down the wall, and by evening, the moisture would have dried, leaving behind dark stains that seemed to form patterns. The patterns were subtle at first, random streaks that could easily be dismissed as natural water damage, but gradually, they began to resemble something more deliberate. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in December. Father Toretti was working late, the chapel illuminated by several portable lamps, as he photographed the fresco's deterioration for his report. The building was empty except for the night security guards, and the only sounds were the distant hum of heating systems and his own breathing. As he adjusted his camera for another shot, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. He turned toward the fresco and felt his blood freeze. The dark streaks on the wall were moving, slowly but visibly spreading downward from St. Lawrence's eyes. But more terrifying still, the patterns were forming letters. In clear, albeit archaic Latin script, words were appearing on the wall: Ignis Eternus, eternal fire. Father Toretti stumbled backward, knocking over one of his lamps. The crash echoed through the empty chapel, and in the sudden darkness, he heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: the sound of crackling flames, though no fire was visible anywhere in the room. The next morning, building maintenance found Father Toretti unconscious on the chapel floor. When he recovered, he insisted that the restoration project be halted immediately. The chapel was sealed, and according to Vatican records, it remains so to this day. But the story doesn't end there. 3 months after the incident, the restoration team that had been scheduled to work on the fresco reported a series of disturbing dreams. Each member experienced the same vision: St. Lawrence, engulfed in flames, speaking directly to them in Latin, warning of a fire that consumes not flesh, but souls. 2 of the team members requested transfers to other projects. The third, Maria Benedetti, a respected art conservator with over 20 years of experience, left the Vatican entirely and never worked on religious art again. Father Toretti eventually returned to his duties, but colleagues noted a profound change in his demeanor. He became obsessed with researching the history of the Chapel of San Lorenzo, spending countless hours in the Vatican secret archives. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. According to records dating back to the 15th century, the chapel had been the site of multiple unexplained incidents. In 1487, a priest reported seeing tears of blood flowing from the fresco. In 1623, a papal commissioner investigating reports of supernatural activity in the chapel, disappeared for 3 days, only to be found wandering the Vatican gardens with no memory of where he had been. Most disturbing of all, Father Toretti found a sealed report from 1943 during World War II, when the chapel had been used as a temporary storage area for Vatican treasures. Allied bombing raids on Rome had forced the church to relocate many priceless artifacts to more secure locations within the Vatican walls. The report, written by Cardinal Alessandro Marchetti, described how workers moving artifacts from the chapel reported feeling an overwhelming sense of burning whenever they approached the fresco. One worker claimed to have been marked by invisible flames and showed his colleagues what appeared to be burn marks on his arms, despite there being no source of fire in the vicinity. Cardinal Marchetti ordered the chapel to be blessed and sealed, but not before conducting his own investigation. His final entry in the report was brief but chilling. The fire that claimed St. Lawrence burns still within these walls. It seeks not wood or flesh, but the essence of faith itself. May God have mercy on those who would disturb his martyr's eternal torment. Today, the chapel of San Lorenzo remains locked and forgotten by most Vatican visitors. But according to security guards who patrol the area, on certain winter nights when the wind howls through the ancient corridors, you can still hear the sound of crackling flames and catch the faint scent of smoke seeping from beneath the sealed doors. Father Toretti never spoke publicly about his experience, but those close to him noted that he would often wake in the middle of the night, claiming to smell burning flesh. He died in 2022, and his final words to his attending physician were reported to be, "The fire, it never stops burning." Sister Maria Esperanza had always found comfort in solitude. As the night librarian for the Vatican's extensive theological collection, she cherished the quiet hours after midnight, when the ancient corridors were empty and she could work in perfect silence. Her office was located directly adjacent to the Chapel of Santa Barbara, a small 16th-century sanctuary that housed the tomb of Cardinal Benedetto Accolti and was rarely visited except during special commemorative masses. The chapel's proximity to her workspace had never bothered Sister Maria. In fact, she found the presence of the sacred space reassuring during her long, solitary nights among the dusty theological tomes. The chapel remained unlocked at all times, a Vatican tradition that allowed for private prayer at any hour, and Sister Maria would occasionally step inside for a few moments of reflection when her work became overwhelming. Everything changed on the night of October 13th, 2020. Exactly 103 years after the final apparition at Fatima. Sister Maria was cataloging a recent donation of medieval manuscripts when she heard something that made her look up from her work, the sound of singing. At first, she thought perhaps she was hearing an echo from another part of the Vatican complex. The ancient buildings were known for carrying sound in unexpected ways, and it wasn't uncommon to hear distant conversations or even music from various quarters. But as she listened more carefully, she realized the voices were coming from directly next door, from the chapel of Santa Barbara. The singing was hauntingly beautiful, a complex polyphonic arrangement that seemed to feature at least 20 voices. Sister Maria recognized the piece as a Gregorian chant, specifically the Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath, traditionally sung during Masses for the dead. The Latin words echoed clearly through the walls: Dies Irae, Dies Illa, Solvet Seclum in Favia, Day of Wrath, that day will dissolve the world in ashes. Sister Maria glanced at her watch. 12:47 a.m. No services were scheduled for the chapel at this hour, and she knew that the building's security protocols would have recorded any official gathering. Curious and somewhat concerned, she decided to investigate. She approached the chapel's entrance quietly, not wanting to disturb what might be a private vigil or prayer service she hadn't been informed about. But as she peered through the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. The chapel was empty, completely empty. Yet the singing continued, as clear and beautiful as if she were standing in the midst of a full choir. The voices seemed to come from every direction at once, from the vaulted ceiling, from behind the altar, from the very walls themselves. The Desirai continued its mournful progression, each note perfectly pitched and timed. Sister Maria stepped into the chapel, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The singing didn't waver or acknowledge her presence in any way. She walked to the center of the nave, directly beneath the chapel's small dome, and the voices seemed to surround her completely. As the chant reached its climactic passage, Lacrimosa dies illa, qua resurgit ex favilla, judicandus homo reus. Tearful will be that day when from the ashes will arise the guilty man to be judged. Sister Maria noticed something that made her skin crawl. The air in the chapel had grown noticeably colder, and her breath was becoming visible in small puffs of vapor. More disturbing still, she began to see movement in her peripheral vision. Subtle, at first, just the suggestion of shadows shifting in the candlelit alcoves. But gradually, the shadows began to take more definite form. They appeared as human silhouettes, standing in the choir stalls that lined the chapel's walls, their mouths moving in perfect synchronization with the ethereal voices. Sister Maria wanted to flee, but found herself frozen in place, transfixed by the otherworldly performance. The shadow figures became increasingly distinct, and she began to recognize the robes and vestments of different religious orders: Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, and others she couldn't immediately identify. They appeared to be from different historical periods, some wearing the simple brown habits of medieval monks, others adorned in the elaborate ceremonial garments of Renaissance-era cardinals. The Dies Irae reached its conclusion, but instead of silence, the phantom choir immediately began another chant. The Libera me, deliver me. The Latin words pleaded for deliverance from eternal death, and as the voices rose and fell in their haunting harmonies, Sister Maria realized that she was witnessing something far beyond her understanding. The shadow figures began to move more freely now, no longer confined to the choir stalls. They processed slowly around the chapel's perimeter, their forms becoming clearer with each step. Sister Maria could make out individual faces now, gaunt, serious expressions marked by centuries of devotion and, she realized with growing horror, suffering. These were not the peaceful spirits of the blessed dead. The faces she saw were marked by anguish, by an eternal longing that transcended death itself, and they were all looking directly at her. The realization broke the spell that had held her motionless. Sister Maria turned and ran from the chapel, not stopping until she reached her office. But even with the door closed and locked behind her, she could still hear the singing, now joined by what sounded like weeping, deep, mournful sobs that seemed to come from souls in unimaginable torment. She spent the rest of the night huddled at her desk, afraid to look toward the chapel, afraid even to close her eyes. The singing continued until dawn, when it gradually faded with the first rays of sunlight streaming through the library windows. The next morning, Sister Maria reported the incident to her supervisor, Mother Superior Francesca Romani. To her surprise, Mother Francesca didn't dismiss her account. Instead, she listened carefully and then retrieved a locked file from her desk. "You're not the first to experience this," Mother Francesca said quietly. "The Chapel of Santa Barbara has a complicated history." She showed Sister Maria documents dating back to the 1800s, all reporting similar incidents. Night staff, security guards, and even visiting clergy had reported hearing phantom choirs in the chapel, always singing masses for the dead, always accompanied by unexplained cold spots and shadow figures. The most detailed account came from Father Roberto Castellani, who had served as the chapel's caretaker from 1923 to 1956. According to his sealed testimony, the supernatural activity in the chapel was connected to its use during the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919. The chapel had served as a temporary morgue for Vatican employees who had died from the disease, and emergency funeral masses were conducted there around the clock for several weeks. Father Castellani believed that the intense concentration of death and grief in the space had created a spiritual imprint, a kind of supernatural recording that played back the final masses said for those souls. His theory was supported by the fact that the phantom choir always sang the same liturgical pieces used during funeral services, and the shadow figures wore the religious habits of the orders that had served during the pandemic. But Father Castellani's account included one detail that particularly troubled Mother Francesca. According to his testimony, the phantom choir wasn't just a harmless replay of past events. The spirits were trapped, unable to find peace, and they sought to draw the living into their eternal vigil. 3 night librarians before Sister Maria had reported similar experiences. All had initially been fascinated by the phenomenon, returning night after night to witness the spectral performance. But each had eventually requested transfers to day positions, claiming that the midnight choir was calling to them in their dreams, inviting them to join their eternal service. One librarian, Brother Thomas Aquinas, had actually been found in the chapel one morning, kneeling before the altar as if in prayer. When roused by security guards, he claimed to have no memory of entering the chapel and insisted that he had been working at his desk all night. Medical examination revealed no signs of sleepwalking or other sleep disorders, but Brother Thomas began experiencing blackouts whenever he worked near the chapel. He was eventually transferred to the Vatican Library's Florence Annex. Mother Francesca's advice to Sister Maria was simple: avoid the chapel of Santa Barbara entirely during night hours. But Sister Maria found this easier said than done. Night after night, as she worked in her office, she would hear the faint sound of chanting beginning just after midnight. The singing seemed to be growing stronger, more insistent, and increasingly difficult to ignore. On Halloween night, 2020, Sister Maria's resolve finally broke. The phantom choir was singing the Veni Creator Spiritus, Come Creator Spirit, a hymn typically sung to invoke the Holy Spirit during important ceremonies. But the way the invisible voices rendered, it felt less like an invocation and more like a summoning. Sister Maria found herself standing at the chapel entrance without conscious memory of having left her desk. The phantom choir had never sounded more beautiful or more sorrowful. The shadow figures were clearer than ever before, and for the first time, one of them turned to look directly at her. It was a young woman in a nun's habit, her face pale but peaceful. She smiled at Sister Maria and gestured toward an empty space in the choir stalls, a space that seemed to be waiting specifically for her. Sister Maria realized with crystal clarity that if she stepped into that chapel, if she joined that eternal vigil, she would never leave. The phantom choir would have claimed another soul, and some future night librarian would see her shadow figure among the others, forever singing masses for the dead who could not find rest. She turned and ran, this time not stopping until she had left the Vatican entirely. She submitted her resignation the next morning via telephone and never returned to collect her personal belongings. The chapel of Santa Barbara still hosts its midnight choir, according to current night staff. But now, Vatican security makes it a policy to escort night workers past the chapel during the hours between midnight and dawn, and no one is permitted to work alone in the adjacent library after 11 p.m. The sacrament of confession has always been one of the Catholic Church's most sacred rituals, a direct line between the penitent soul and divine forgiveness. For Father Alessandro Benedetto, hearing confessions was both the most rewarding and most challenging aspect of his ministry. As a senior priest assigned to one of the Vatican's lesser-known confessional chapels, he had listened to the sins and sorrows of cardinals, bishops, visiting dignitaries, and ordinary faithful for over 30 years. The chapel of San Giuseppe, where Father Benedetto conducted his ministry, was a small, intimate space built in the 17th century. Its 2 ornate wooden confessionals, carved by master craftsmen and blessed by Pope Urban VIII himself, had witnessed countless acts of contrition and absolution. The chapel's acoustic properties were particularly suited to the hushed tones of confession. Sound carried clearly between the confessional booth and the priest's chamber, yet remained contained within the sacred space. Father Benedetto had always taken pride in his ability to provide comfort and guidance to troubled souls. His gentle manner and decades of experience had earned him a reputation as one of the Vatican's most effective confessors. Cardinals would specifically request his services for particularly sensitive matters, knowing that his discretion was absolute and his spiritual counsel profound. But in the autumn of 2021, Father Benedetto encountered a penitent, unlike any he had served before, one whose confessions would shake his faith to its very foundation and ultimately drive him to question everything he believed about the nature of evil and redemption. The first confession came on a Tuesday evening in November. Father Benedetto had just finished hearing the confessions of several Vatican employees when he heard the familiar creak of the confessional door opening. He prepared himself to listen, as he had thousands of times before, speaking the traditional words, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." But the voice that responded was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was simultaneously ancient and ageless, neither distinctly male nor female, carrying within it harmonics that seemed to resonate not just in the air but in Father Benedetto's very bones. "I have committed sins beyond counting," the voice said, "and I seek not absolution, but understanding." The tone was not pleading or remorseful, as Father Benedetto was accustomed to hearing. Instead, it carried an unsettling note of curiosity, as if the speaker were conducting an experiment rather than seeking spiritual guidance. "All sins can be forgiven through God's infinite mercy," Father Benedetto replied, following the standard ritual. "Tell me what weighs upon your soul." What followed was a confession unlike any in Father Benedetto's experience. The penitent described acts that went far beyond ordinary human sin. Murders committed across centuries, souls corrupted through whispered temptations, entire bloodlines destroyed through carefully orchestrated tragedies. The voice spoke of these acts with a detached, clinical precision that was somehow more horrifying than any display of remorse or evil glee would have been. But most disturbing of all, the confession included details about events that had occurred within the Vatican itself. The voice described private conversations between high-ranking clergy members that had taken place behind closed doors, revealed the hidden motivations behind certain papal decisions, and even mentioned Father Benedetto's own private struggles with doubt and faith, struggles he had never shared with another living soul. "How could you know these things?" Father Benedetto asked, his voice trembling despite his attempt to maintain professional composure. "I know because I have been watching," the voice replied. "I have been present for every prayer whispered in desperation, every moment of doubt in the darkness, every compromise made in the name of the greater good. I am the shadow that follows every act of faith, the question that underlies every certainty." Father Benedetto wanted to end the session, to demand that the penitent identify themselves, but he found himself unable to speak. The voice continued its impossible confession, detailing acts of manipulation and corruption that spanned centuries of church history. It spoke of influencing the election of certain popes, of planting seeds of discord during ecumenical councils, of subtly corrupting the faith of countless believers through whispered doubts and carefully placed temptations. The confession lasted over 2 hours, far longer than any normal session. When it finally ended, Father Benedetto heard the confessional door close, but he didn't hear footsteps walking away. When he emerged from his side of the booth, the chapel was empty. He tried to convince himself that the encounter had been a delusion, perhaps brought on by stress or fatigue. But the next Tuesday, at exactly the same time, the mysterious penitent returned. This time, the confession focused on more recent events. The voice described its role in various scandals that had rocked the church, its influence on specific individuals whom Father Benedetto knew personally, and its ongoing efforts to corrupt the faithful from within. Most chillingly, it began to reference details from Father Benedetto's own life, his childhood in rural Italy, his decision to enter the priesthood, his secret moments of doubt and spiritual struggle. "You wonder why I tell you these things," the voice said, seeming to read Father Benedetto's thoughts. "You wonder what I hope to accomplish through these confessions. The answer is simple. I seek to understand the nature of forgiveness. If God's mercy is truly infinite, can even I find redemption? And if I cannot, what does that say about the promises your church makes to ordinary sinners? Father Benedetto realized with growing horror that he was being used as an unwilling participant in some cosmic experiment. The entity, for he had become convinced that his mysterious penitent was something far beyond human, was testing the limits of divine mercy through him. Week after week, the confessions continued. Father Benedetto began to dread Tuesday evenings, but found himself unable to avoid them. When he tried to change his schedule, he would inexplicably find himself in the confessional at the appointed time, with no clear memory of how he had gotten there. The entity's confessions grew progressively more disturbing. It described acts of corruption that were still ongoing, individuals within the Vatican who were unknowingly serving its purposes, and plans for future manipulations that would shake the Church to its core. It spoke of placing thoughts in the minds of influential clerics, of subtly altering the meaning of crucial documents, of turning the faithful against each other through carefully orchestrated controversies. But perhaps most horrifying of all, the entity began to confess its influence over Father Benedetto himself. It revealed how it had been shaping his thoughts and decisions for years, how his most profound spiritual insights had actually been subtle corruptions designed to lead him away from true faith, how his reputation as a wise counselor had been built on advice that, while appearing helpful, ultimately served to weaken the spiritual foundations of those who sought his guidance. "You have been my greatest success," the voice told him during one particularly devastating session. "Through you, I have corrupted hundreds of souls, each believing they were receiving divine guidance. Every word of comfort you have spoken, every act of absolution you have granted, has been tainted by my influence. You are not a servant of God, Father Benedetto. You are my unwitting instrument." The revelation shattered Father Benedetto's faith completely. If he could not trust his own spiritual instincts, if his entire ministry had been corrupted from within, then what meaning did any of it have? How could he continue to offer spiritual guidance when he could no longer distinguish between divine inspiration and demonic influence? Father Benedetto began to research the history of his confessional chapel, hoping to find some explanation for what he was experiencing. What he discovered only deepened his despair. According to sealed Vatican archives, the Chapel of San Giuseppe had been built on the site of an earlier structure that had housed a notorious 16th-century mystic named Brother Giacomo da Viterbo. Brother Giacomo had claimed to receive visions directly from God, and his prophecies had attracted a significant following among both clergy and laity. But church investigators had eventually determined that his visions were actually demonic in origin. Brother Giacomo had been secretly practicing occult rituals, believing that he could achieve union with God by first mastering the forces of darkness. The investigation revealed that Brother Giacomo had been unknowingly channeling a powerful demonic entity that had been using his apparent sanctity to corrupt others within the church. His confessions, for he had eventually confessed his true activities to a Vatican investigator, had revealed a web of spiritual corruption that reached into the highest levels of the papal court. Brother Giacomo was executed for heresy in 1587, but according to the investigative reports, the entity he had been channeling was never fully banished. The site had been consecrated multiple times, blessed with holy relics, and eventually rebuilt as the Chapel of San Giuseppe in an attempt to purify the spiritual contamination. But the report suggested that the entity might have simply gone dormant, waiting for the right opportunity to resume its work. Father Benedetto realized that he had become the entity's new instrument, just as Brother Giacomo had been centuries before. The Tuesday night confessions were not actually attempts at redemption. They were a form of spiritual torture, designed to break down his faith and render him more susceptible to demonic influence. Armed with this knowledge, Father Benedetto decided to confront the entity directly during their next encounter. He prepared himself through intensive prayer and fasting, consulted with Vatican exorcists, though he could not reveal the full extent of his situation, and entered the confessional determined to break the cycle of manipulation. When the entity arrived for its customary confession, Father Benedetto was ready. "I know what you are," he said before the voice could begin its usual recitation of sins. "I know why you're here, and I know what you want from me." The response was immediate and chilling. The temperature in the confessional dropped dramatically, and Father Benedetto could see his breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The entity's voice, when it came, carried a note of amusement rather than surprise. "Do you indeed?" it said. "And what do you propose to do with this knowledge?" "I will no longer listen to your confessions," Father Benedetto declared. "I will not participate in your mockery of the sacrament. I cast you out, in the name of—" "In the name of whom?" the entity interrupted. "In the name of the God whose servant you believe yourself to be? The God whose guidance you can no longer trust? How do you know that your current defiance is not simply another form of the manipulation you seek to escape?" The question struck Father Benedetto like a physical blow. How could he trust his own spiritual instincts when they had been compromised for so long? How could he be certain that his current resolve was divinely inspired rather than another layer of demonic deception? The entity seemed to sense his confusion. "You begin to understand the true nature of your predicament. There is no action you can take, no prayer you can offer, no ritual you can perform that you can trust to be untainted by my influence. You are trapped not by my power, but by your own doubt. And doubt, dear Father, is the most effective prison ever devised." Father Benedetto spent the rest of that night in prayer, but even as he knelt before the altar, he found himself questioning whether his prayers were reaching God or being intercepted and corrupted by the entity that had claimed dominion over his spiritual life. The next morning, he submitted his resignation to the Vatican administration and requested immediate transfer to a contemplative monastery where he could attempt to rebuild his relationship with God in silence and solitude. His request was granted, but according to those who knew him, Father Benedetto never recovered from his experience in the chapel of San Giuseppe. He spent his remaining years in constant prayer and penance, but those who visited him reported that he seemed to be engaged in an ongoing internal struggle, as if he were still receiving confessions from an invisible penitent. Father Benedetto died in 2023, and his final words to his attending physician were reported to be, "I still don't know. I still can't tell. Which voice is truly mine?" The chapel of San Giuseppe continues to operate, but with new confessors who rotate on a monthly basis. Vatican policy now prohibits any single priest from serving as the chapel's primary confessor for more than 30 days at a time, and all confessors are required to undergo regular spiritual evaluation. However, according to current staff, every confessor who serves in the chapel eventually reports similar experiences to those described by Father Benedetto. Each claims to have encountered a mysterious penitent whose confessions challenge the very foundations of faith and redemption. The Vatican's official position is that these experiences represent spiritual attacks designed to test the faith of its clergy. But among those who have served in the chapel of San Giuseppe, a different theory has emerged, that some sins are so profound, so fundamental to the nature of evil itself, that they cannot be absolved through ordinary means, and that the entity seeking confession in the chapel is not looking for forgiveness, but for validation of its belief that redemption is ultimately impossible. Whether this entity represents a genuine supernatural presence or a manifestation of the psychological pressures faced by those who dedicate their lives to combating evil, the chapel of San Giuseppe remains a place where the boundaries between faith and doubt, redemption and damnation, become uncomfortably blurred. And every Tuesday evening, as darkness falls over Vatican City, those who work in the surrounding buildings report hearing the faint sound of voices from within the chapel of San Giuseppe, the quiet murmur of confession, and the gentle responses of a priest offering comfort to a troubled soul, repeated endlessly, like a prayer that can never quite reach its intended destination.